A freezing blizzard at Chicago O'Hare isn't the only storm brewing on Flight 404. When Preston Vance, a high-powered corporate consultant, decides the quiet man in a hoodie doesn't look the part for first class, he initiates a brutal power play to get him removed. He thinks he's optimizing the cabin. He thinks money gives him the right to bully. But he made one critical calculation error. The man he's trying to kick off isn't just a passenger. He's the new owner of the airline, and he's currently conducting his own silent audit. Witness the ultimate lesson in why competence is the only currency that matters. The snow swirling against the reinforced glass of Chicago O'Hare Terminal 3 was hypnotic, a chaotic white curtain that seemed to be actively conspiring against the schedule of Meridian Airways Flight 404 to London Heathrow. Inside the gate area, the air was thick with the specific, humid anxiety that accompanies winter travel. It smelled of wet wool, stale coffee, and the impending doom of a cancellation. Julian Thorne sat in a corner seat near the window, away from the clustered charging stations where passengers fought over outlets like animals at a watering hole. He was 58 years old, a man of solid, oak-like build, wearing a charcoal gray hoodie that looked simple from a distance but was woven from high-gauge cashmere. On his lap sat a tablet displaying a dense spreadsheet of fuel hedging projections for the next fiscal quarter. He wasn't reading a novel or doom-scrolling through news of the blizzard. He was working. To the casual observer, Julian was invisible. He was a black man in casual clothes sitting quietly in a busy airport. In the hierarchy of travel, he was background noise. To Julian, however, the terminal was a laboratory. He watched the gate agents, specifically a young woman named Sarah, who was currently managing a line of 20 frustrated passengers with only one working computer terminal. He noted the time it took for her to reboot the system. For minutes. He noted the lack of a floating supervisor to intercept the angry customers. He tapped a note into his tablet. Ground operations ORD. System redundancy failure. Staff support inadequate. Action item. Review IT infrastructure budget. He wasn't angry. Julian rarely got angry. Anger was an inefficiency. He was calculating. He had acquired the majority stake in Meridian Airways exactly 31 days ago. The board knew. The C-suite knew. But the frontline staff and certainly the public had no idea that the man sitting in the corner, adjusting his glasses and watching the de-icing trucks, was the chairman of the board. He preferred it that way. You learned nothing from the back of a limousine. You learned everything from the back of the line. Across the waiting area, a voice cut through the low hum of conversation like a serrated knife. I do not care about the optics, Bob. I care about the closing date. If we do not have signatures by Friday, the entire restructuring is dead in the water. Julian didn't look up, but he shifted his attention. The voice belonged to a man pacing near the boarding door. Preston Vance. 50 years old, wearing a suit that cost more than a Honda Civic, with a Bluetooth earpiece blinking aggressively in his ear. He was sweating despite the chill in the terminal. He carried a leather briefcase that he swung with a disregard for the personal space of those around him. Preston was a crisis management consultant. Julian knew the type well. They sold panic and billed for the antidote. Currently, Preston was the one panicking. The merger he was overseeing in London was shaky. His bonus, his reputation, and his liquidity were tied to a meeting that was exactly 9 hours away. Every snowflake hitting the window felt to Preston like a personal attack on his net worth. The gate agent, Sarah, picked up the microphone. Her voice cracked slightly with fatigue. Ladies and gentlemen, Meridian Airways Flight 404 to London is now ready for boarding. We invite our first-class passengers and Diamond Key members to board at this time. Preston Vance moved before the sentence was finished. He cut in front of a mother holding an infant, flashing his digital boarding pass at the scanner as if it were a police badge. He didn't look at the agent. He didn't say thank you. He marched down the jet bridge, thumbing a text message, radiating an aura of self-importance so dense it practically had its own gravity. Julian waited. He closed his tablet cover, slid it into his battered leather satchel, and stood up. He moved with a slow, deliberate cadence. He walked to the gate, smiled at Sarah, and waited for her to acknowledge him. Have a safe flight, sir, she said, not looking up, her eyes glazed over. Thank you, Sarah. Hang in there, Julian said softly. She looked up then, surprised by the use of her name and the genuine tone. She managed a weak, real smile. Thanks. Next please. Julian walked down the jet bridge. The cold air of the tunnel bit at his face. He checked his mental inventory. He was about to enter a metal tube with 300 strangers for 8 hours. He took a breath, centering himself. He was about to step into his own asset, but for tonight, he was just a passenger in seat 1A. The first-class cabin of the Boeing 777 was a sanctuary of beige leather and warm lighting, designed to make people forget they were hurtling through the stratosphere. It was a space of commerce and privilege. Julian entered and saw Preston Vance already settled in seat 1B, the aisle seat directly next to his window seat. Preston had already spread out. His blazer was on the hanger, his laptop was open, files were strewn across the center console, and he was barking into his phone again. No, I need the relentless audit, Bob. Cut the fat. If they are redundant, fire them. I don't care if they have families, I care if they have function. Julian stepped into the row. Excuse me, he said, his voice a low baritone. Preston didn't look up. He waved a hand dismissively, assuming it was a flight attendant. 1 second. Julian stood still. He didn't sigh. He didn't repeat himself. He just waited. His shadow fell across Preston's spreadsheet. Preston finally looked up, annoyed. He saw the hoodie. He saw the denim jeans. He saw the battered leather bag. He saw a black face. And in Preston's brain, a categorization algorithm ran instantly and came up with a result that comforted his own insecurity. Oh, Preston said, his voice dropping the aggressive business tone for something far more insidious. A patronizing familiarity. Hey there, buddy. I think you're turned around. I am in seat 1A, Julian said, holding up his phone with the mobile boarding pass. Preston squinted at the screen, then back at Julian. He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Ah, I see. You're deadheading, right? Julian paused. He knew the term. Deadheading. When an airline employee flies free to get to another airport for a shift. It was a logical assumption for someone like Preston, whose worldview could not reconcile a man in a hoodie sitting in a $10,000 seat unless it was a handout. No, Julian said simply. Non-rev then? Employee, family, and friends? Look, pal, usually you guys take the jump seat or wait for economy to fill up. I've got a lot of sensitive documents out here. Confidential merger stuff. Preston gestured to the papers sprawling over Julian's side of the shared console. It would be better for everyone if you just grabbed a spot in the back. Or maybe the crew rest area. I'm sure the pilot would let you sit up front if you asked nicely. Julian looked at the papers. He recognized the letterhead on one of the documents. Vance Consulting. He memorized the logo. My ticket is paid, Mr. Vance, Julian said. He stepped forward, forcing Preston to pull his legs in. And I believe the overhead bin space is shared. Julian lifted his satchel and placed it in the bin. He moved with an economy of motion that suggested he had done this 1,000 times. Preston watched him, his mouth slightly ajar. It wasn't just the refusal that stunned him. It was the lack of deference. Julian didn't sound defensive. He sounded bored. Preston snatched his papers off the console, stuffing them aggressively into his briefcase. Fine. Just try not to elbow me. I have actual work to do. Julian sat down in 1A. He buckled his seatbelt over his hoodie. He didn't pull out a laptop. He didn't pull out a phone. He reached into his bag and pulled out a worn paperback copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. He opened it to a bookmarked page, adjusted his reading glasses, and tuned Preston Vance out completely. In the galley, Elena, the lead flight attendant, was watching. She was 45, a veteran of the skies who had survived 3 mergers, 2 bankruptcies, and the pandemic. She could spot trouble from 40 rows away. She saw the body language in row 1. The way the man in the suit, Mr. Vance, 1B, diamond status, frequent complainer, was staring at the man in the window seat. She saw Vance's jaw working, grinding his teeth. Elena checked her manifest. 1A, Thorne, Julian. Full fare. No special meal request. No notes. Just a name. She walked out into the cabin with a tray of pre-departure beverages. Champagne, orange juice, water. Good evening, gentlemen, she said, her voice practicing that specific octave of cheerful neutrality required of her job. Champagne before takeoff? Preston grabbed a glass of champagne without looking at her. I need you to hang my jacket, he said. And can we get some wipes? The armrest feels sticky. Certainly, Mr. Vance. Elena took the jacket. And for you, Mr. Thorne? Julian looked up from his book. He took off his glasses. Water, please. Thank you. Elena poured the water. She noticed Julian's eyes. They were calm. Unsettlingly calm. Most passengers were frantic during a blizzard. This man looked like he was sitting by a fireplace. Is everything comfortable for you so far? Elena asked, a subtle code to check if Preston had already started something. It is fine, Julian said. Preston scoffed. He took a loud sip of champagne. It's a little crowded, actually. Elena, honey, quick question. Elena braced herself. The honey was always a bad sign. Yes, Mr. Vance? Are we fully booked? Yes, sir. Every seat. The weather has caused a lot of cancellations, so we're taking overflow. Preston swirled his glass, gesturing vaguely at Julian with the stem. Right. Well, I'm a Diamond Key member. I spend about, 80 grand a year with this airline? We appreciate your loyalty, Mr. Vance. I'm sure you do. Look, I usually get the seat next to me blocked off for privacy. It's a courtesy you guys do for high-value flyers. I need to spread out. Is there any way we can reaccommodate this gentleman? Maybe move him to a crew seat? Or offer him a voucher for tomorrow? Elena felt the heat rise in her neck. She looked at Julian. He was reading his book, turning a page with agonizing slowness, as if he were alone in a library. Mr. Vance, Elena said, keeping her voice low. Mr. Thorne is a confirmed first-class passenger. The flight is full. I cannot move a passenger who has a valid boarding pass just because you want space. That is against federal regulations regarding denied boarding. Preston laughed. It was a sharp barking sound. Regulations? Come on. I'm talking about customer service. Look at him. He's reading a philosophy book. He's obviously a student or a teacher or something. He's not going to mind $1,000 voucher. Ask him. I will not ask him that, sir, Elena said, her tone hardening. Fine, Preston snapped. I'll do your job for you. Preston turned in his seat, physically encroaching on Julian's space. Hey, pal. Julian marked his place in the book with a finger and looked at Preston. I'm offering you a deal, Preston said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a money clip. He peeled off 5 $100 bills. This is $500. Cash. Tax-free. Plus whatever voucher the airline gives you. You take this, you get off, you grab a nice dinner, you sleep in a hotel, you fly out tomorrow. The cabin had gone quiet. The couple in 2A and 2B stopped talking. A woman in 1F, an older lady with silver hair, peered over her spectacles. Julian looked at the cash. It was crumpled. I have a meeting in London, Julian said. Preston rolled his eyes. Right. A meeting. What is it? Study abroad orientation? Look, 500 is a lot of money. That's probably your rent. Don't be proud, just be smart. Take the win. Julian turned his body fully toward Preston. The movement was slight, but the shift in energy was massive. Mr. Vance, Julian said, his voice soft but carrying to the back of the galley. You seem to be laboring under a series of expensive assumptions. I am not deadheading. I am not a student. And I am not in need of your liquidity. Put your money away before you embarrass yourself further. Preston's face flushed a deep blotchy red. He wasn't used to being told no. And he certainly wasn't used to being spoken to like a child by a man in a hoodie. He jammed the money back into his pocket. I'm trying to help you out, he hissed. You don't belong up here. You make the vibe unprofessional. Julian went back to his book. The conversation is over. Suddenly, the overhead speakers chimed. The pilot's voice crackled through. Folks, this is Captain Miller from the flight deck. Bad news, I'm afraid. Ground control has put a stop on all departures due to visibility. We are currently number 40 in line for de-icing. We're looking at a ground hold of approximately 45 minutes to an hour before we can push back. We're going to need everyone to stay seated with seatbelts fastened. We apologize for the delay. The cabin groaned. But for Preston Vance, the announcement was a catastrophe. An hour? Preston shouted, slamming his hand on the armrest. He looked at his watch. I don't have an hour. I have a connection in Heathrow. He whipped his phone out and started dialing. Sir, Elena stepped forward. You cannot make voice calls now that the door is closed. I am not losing a $40 million contract because of a snow flurry. Preston yelled, ignoring her. Julian sighed. He closed his book. The piece was gone. He looked at the window. The snow was piling up on the wing. He knew the de-icing protocols at O'Hare. 40 minutes was optimistic. It would be 90. And he was trapped in a steel tube with a man who was rapidly losing his mind. Preston's call went to voicemail. He slammed the phone down on the console, hard enough that it skidded and hit Julian's elbow. Watch it, Preston snapped, as if it were Julian's fault. You are vibrating, Mr. Vance, Julian said. It is affecting the seat. Oh, shut up, Preston spat. You sit there with your book and your zen attitude. You have no idea what pressure is. You have no idea what it takes to sit in a seat like this legitimately. Julian looked at him. Really? Yeah, really. This isn't a charity ward. It's for people who generate value. What value do you generate, huh? You're taking up space. You're an inefficiency. Preston stood up. He couldn't sit still. He looked around the cabin seeking allies. He needed to validate his anger. He needed the group to agree with him that Julian was the problem, not the snow, not the merger. He leaned toward the couple in row 2. Does this seem right to you? Preston whispered loudly, pointing a thumb at Julian. No luggage. Won't talk. Just stares. We're sitting on the tarmac for an hour with a guy who looks like he walked in off the street. The man in 2A, a young tech CEO type wearing a Patagonia vest, looked uncomfortable. I think he's just reading, man. Preston shook his head. You don't get it. You don't read the security bulletins. The quiet ones are the ones you worry about. He hasn't ordered a drink. He hasn't opened a screen. Who comes into first class and doesn't work or drink? Preston was gaslighting the room. He was using fear, the primal fear of air travel security, to weaponize the passengers against Julian. Elena came back down the aisle. Mr. Vance, please sit down. The seatbelt sign is on. I don't feel safe, Preston said, loudly enough for the whole cabin to hear. Excuse me? Elena stopped. I said I don't feel safe. This passenger next to me. He's acting erratic. Hostile. I think he's a security risk. Julian slowly took off his reading glasses. He placed them on the tray table. He turned to Elena. Elena, Julian said. Mr. Vance is attempting to manufacture a security incident because he is stressed about a business deal. I would suggest you document his statement exactly as he said it. Don't you talk about me. Preston pointed a finger at Julian. You threatened me. I did no such thing, Julian said. He did. He said I'd be sorry. Preston lied, his voice rising to a frantic pitch. He looked at the passengers. You heard him, right? The cabin was tense. People were looking. Bias is a subtle poison. Once introduced, it makes people question what they saw. The lady in 1F, Margaret, frowned. She had been watching the whole time. She opened her mouth to speak, but Preston cut her off. I want the captain, Preston demanded, or get the ground manager back on here. I am not flying with this man. Either he goes, or I'm filing a formal complaint with the FAA about unsafe cabin conditions. Elena looked terrified. Not of Preston, but of the situation spiraling. A security complaint on the ground, even a fake one, meant paperwork. It meant delays. It meant the police. I will call the gate agent, Elena said, her voice shaking slightly. But you need to sit down. Preston sat, a smirk of triumph crossing his face. He had pulled the lever. He had used the magic words. Security risk. He looked at Julian. You picked the wrong day to fly, buddy, Preston whispered. Julian picked up his book. He didn't read it. He was thinking about the ground manager, Kevin. He had seen Kevin earlier. Kevin was weak. Kevin would want the path of least resistance. Julian looked at the snow outside. He realized with a heavy heart that he was about to have to ruin several people's careers. The jet bridge alarm beeped. The door opened. The cold air rushed in again, followed by Kevin, the ground manager, looking flustered and annoyed. His high-visibility vest streaked with melting snow. What is the problem? We are about to lose our de-icing slot, Kevin barked, looking at Elena. Preston raised his hand like a student in class. The problem is here. Seat 1A. He's been aggressive, making threats and refusing to follow crew instructions. I don't feel safe flying with him, And neither do these other passengers. Preston gestured broadly to the silent cabin. No one spoke up to contradict him. The silence of the bystanders was deafening. Kevin looked at Preston white suit diamond member. Then he looked at Julian black hoodie silent. Kevin sighed. He didn't ask Elena for her version. He didn't ask the witnesses. He looked at his watch. He needed the plane to move. Sir, Kevin said to Julian, I'm going to need you to grab your things. Julian looked at Kevin. He saw the calculation in the manager's eyes. It wasn't about justice. It was about speed. On what grounds? Julian asked. Captain's discretion, Kevin lied. We have a report of disruptive behavior. We can rebook you for tomorrow. Let's not make a scene. Come on. Julian didn't move. He kept his hands folded on his lap. I have a ticket, Julian said. I have ID. I have broken no laws. If Mr. Vance feels unsafe, he is free to deplane. I am staying. Preston laughed. See? He's refusing orders. That's a federal offense right there. Kevin's face hardened. He was losing patience. Sir, if you don't come voluntarily, I have to call the police. And that means you leave in handcuffs. Is that what you want? Julian stared at Kevin. The threat hung in the recycled air of the cabin. Call them, Julian said. Kevin blinked. What? Call the police, Julian repeated, his voice dropping an octave, becoming something solid and immovable. But make sure you call the Port Authority, not the Chicago PD. Because when you file a false report of interference with a flight crew to remove a paying passenger based on a biased complaint, you are triggering a federal investigation under DOT Part 382. Julian leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto Kevin's. Kevin, promise you, if the police step onto this aircraft, this plane does not leave the gate tonight. The cabin was dead silent. Even Preston stopped moving. Kevin hesitated. He looked at Julian again, really looked at him this time. This wasn't the defiance of an unruly passenger. This was the confidence of someone who knew the rulebook better than the referee. But Kevin was too far in. He had challenged the man in front of an audience. His ego was now the pilot. Fine, Kevin snapped. Have it your way. Kevin grabbed his radio. Operations, this is Gate B4. I need law enforcement to the aircraft immediately. We have a non-compliant passenger in first class. Preston sat back, crossing his arms, a satisfied grin spreading across his face. Game over, pal, Preston whispered. Julian turned his head slowly to look at Preston. The game hasn't started yet, Mr. Vance. Julian closed his eyes. He waited for the heavy footsteps of the police. He prepared his mind. He wasn't just a passenger anymore. He was the chairman. And the audit was about to begin. The silence that followed Kevin's radio call was heavy. A physical weight that seemed to press down on the cabin of Flight 404. The first-class cabin, usually a sanctuary of soft leather and hushed tones, had transformed into a cage. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault on the fuselage, the wind howling a low, mournful note that vibrated through the floorboards. Inside, the only sound was the rhythmic tapping of Preston Vance's shoe against the carpeted bulkhead. Preston was vibrating with adrenaline and a smug sense of victory. He pulled his phone out again, shielding the screen from Julian, and typed a furious text to his assistant. Nightmare flight. Delay. Removing a disruptive passenger now. Will call when airborne. He felt justified. In his world, the world of high-stakes consulting and corporate optimization, if a variable didn't fit the model, you removed it. Julian Thorne, with his silence and his hoodie and his defiant stare, was a variable that Preston could not calculate. Therefore, Julian had to go. Julian sat motionless in seat 1A. He had placed his hands on his knees, palms open and visible. It was a posture he had learned 30 years ago in the Air Force, and later refined during tense negotiations with union leaders and hostile board members. It was the posture of a man who had nothing to hide and everything to observe. He wasn't looking at Preston. He was looking at the forward galley door, counting the seconds. He knew the response time for the Chicago Police Department's aviation unit. From the terminal precinct to Gate B4, walking speed, factoring in the crowds, 4 minutes. Elena, the flight attendant, stood in the galley. Her hands were shaking. She gripped a bottle of water, her knuckles white. She looked at Julian, her eyes wide with an apology she couldn't speak aloud. She knew this was wrong. Every instinct in her 20-year career screamed that the man in 1A was not the problem. But the hierarchy of aviation was strict. The ground manager outranked her. The captain outranked the ground manager. And the police outranked everyone. She felt powerless, a cog in a machine that was malfunctioning in real time. Kevin, the ground manager, stood by the cockpit door, crossing and uncrossing his arms. He was already regretting the call. He checked his tablet. The delay was costing the airline $600 a minute in fuel, crew time, and gate fees. He looked at Julian, hoping the man would just stand up and leave. Why did he have to be so difficult? Why couldn't he just take the voucher? Kevin told himself he was just doing his job. He was protecting the schedule. He was de-escalating. But deep down in the pit of his stomach, he felt the cold prickle of shame. He had chosen the path of least resistance, and that path was paved with bias. 3 minutes passed. Preston leaned over the center console. "You know," he whispered, his voice dripping with faux sympathy. "It's not too late. You can still walk off. Save yourself the handcuffs. I'm sure they won't press charges if you just cooperate." Julian turned his head slowly. His eyes were dark, unreadable pools. "Mr. Vance," Julian said, his voice calm, level, and terrifyingly devoid of fear. "I am not worried about handcuffs. I am worried about your blood pressure. You seem to be under the impression that the police work for you. That is a dangerous misconception." Preston scoffed, turning away. "We'll see." Then came the sound. Heavy boots on the jet bridge. The metal clanking of the transition plate. The thump of authority. 2 officers entered the aircraft. They were large men, bundled in heavy tactical jackets against the cold, snow melting on their shoulders. The lead officer, Officer Davis, was younger, maybe 30, with a buzz cut and eyes that scanned the cabin for threats. His hand rested instinctively near his belt, not on his weapon, but close enough to signal readiness. His partner, Officer Miller, was older, weary-looking, holding a notepad. "Where is the subject?" Officer Davis asked, his voice booming in the confined space. Kevin stepped forward, pointing a finger at 1A. "Right here. Seat 1A. Refusing to deplane. Disruptive behavior." Officer Davis moved down the aisle. The air in the cabin seemed to ignite. The passengers in row 2 held their breath. The young Texio pulled out his phone and started recording, tucking it low against his chest to be discreet. This was the moment everyone feared. The viral moment. The escalation. Preston Vance sat up straighter, adjusting his tie. "Officers, thank God. This man has been threatening me for the last hour. He's unstable." Officer Davis ignored Preston. He focused on Julian. He saw a large black man in a hoodie. He saw the potential for a struggle. His training kicked in. "Control the space, control the hands." "Sir," Officer Davis said, stopping at row 1. "I need you to stand up and grab your personal belongings. You are being removed from this flight." Julian did not stand up. He kept his hands on his knees, perfectly still. He did not make a sudden move. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked Officer Davis in the eye. "Officer," Julian said, "before I comply with your order, I need to verify something for the record. Are you acting on a direct captain's order regarding safety of flight, or are you acting on a complaint from a third party regarding a customer service dispute?" Officer Davis paused. It was not the reaction he expected. Usually people shouted. Usually people begged. Or they swore. They didn't ask clarifying questions about jurisdiction. "The airline has requested your removal, sir," Davis said, his tone hardening. "That gives us the authority. Now let's not make this difficult. Stand up." Julian nodded slowly. He didn't move his body, but his presence seemed to expand, filling the row. "Officer, I am compelled to inform you that under DOT Regulation 14 CFR Part 382, removing a compliant passenger based on the bias of another passenger is a violation of federal civil rights. If you lay hands on me without an articulate safety threat, you are piercing the corporate veil of the airline and accepting personal liability for a false arrest." Preston laughed nervously. "Oh, listen to him. Jailhouse lawyer. Just get him off." Officer Davis looked at Preston, annoyed by the interruption. He looked back at Julian. He saw the calmness. He saw the lack of agitation. This didn't look like a drunk or a maniac. This looked like a man who was waiting for a chess move. Davis hesitated. His hand moved away from his belt. Sir, if the airline wants you off, you have to get off. We can sort out the legal stuff on the jet bridge. Julian spoke again, softer this time, almost like he was giving advice. Officer, look at the cockpit door. Has the captain come out? Has the captain signed a complaint? Davis looked. The cockpit door was closed. If I am a threat to the safety of this flight, Julian continued, why is the captain not here? Why is the ground manager the only one speaking? Kevin, the ground manager, wiped sweat from his forehead. Officer, just remove him. We are losing our slot. I authorize it. Davis took a step forward. He reached for Julian's arm. Sir, I'm giving you one last chance. Stand up. Suddenly, a voice cut from across the aisle. Officer, stop. It wasn't Julian. It was the woman in seat 1F. Margaret. The older woman with the silver hair and the knitting bag. She had taken off her reading glasses. Her voice was sharp, authoritative, the voice of someone who was used to silencing courtrooms. Officer, I am a retired federal circuit judge, Margaret said. I have been watching this entire interaction. The man in 1A has not raised his voice once. He has not made a single threat. The man in 1B, however, has been verbally abusive, has attempted to bribe the passenger, and has manufactured this entire crisis because he wants more legroom. Preston spun around. Shut up, lady. Stay out of this. Margaret ignored him. She looked at Officer Davis. If you remove the man in 1A, you are participating in a civil rights violation. I will testify to that fact. And I will make sure your precinct commander knows exactly how you utilized your discretion tonight. Officer Davis froze. He looked from Margaret to Kevin to Julian. The dynamic had shifted. This wasn't a simple removal anymore. This was a minefield. Kevin, Davis said, turning to the manager. You told us he was making threats. He was. Kevin stammered. He threatened the schedule. He threatened the airline with legal action. That is not a safety threat, Kevin, Davis snapped. That is a customer service problem. We are not your bouncers. Preston realized he was losing the room. He stood up, towering over the officer. Are you kidding me? Do your job. I pay taxes. I am a Diamond member. I demand you arrest this man. Sit down, sir. Davis shouted, pointing a finger at Preston. Preston recoiled. You're yelling at me? I'm the victim here. The chaos reached a fever pitch. Voices were raised. The baby in the back started crying. And in the midst of it all, Julian remained perfectly still, watching the cockpit door. Then the door opened. Captain Mike Miller stepped out. He was a man cut from granite, with silver hair and 4 gold stripes on his shoulders. He held a coffee cup in one hand and the manifest in the other. He looked furious. Not fear furious, but dad furious. The kind of anger that comes from incompetence wasting his time. What in the hell is going on back here? Miller bellowed. His voice was deeper than the officers, deeper than the engines. I'm trying to run a checklist and I can hear you screaming through the reinforced door. The cabin fell silent instantly. The captain was the ultimate authority. On the ground, the police had power. In the air or on a live aircraft, the captain was God. Captain, Kevin stepped forward looking relieved. Finally, Captain, we have a situation. Passenger in 1A is refusing to deplane. Police are here to assist. Miller looked at the police officers. He looked at Preston, who was red-faced and panting. He looked at Margaret, who was glaring at Preston. Then he looked at 1A. Julian slowly turned his head. He looked up at Captain Miller. He didn't smile. He just nodded, a small subtle dipping of his chin. Captain Miller squinted. He took a step closer, peering through the dim mood lighting of the cabin. He looked at the face of the man in the hoodie. He looked at the eyes. Miller stopped. His grip on the coffee cup tightened. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. A look of total, bewildering recognition washed over his face. It was the look of a soldier recognizing his commanding officer in a trench. Captain Miller didn't look at the police. He didn't look at Kevin. He walked straight past them. He stood directly in front of seat 1A. He didn't ask for a boarding pass. He didn't ask for an explanation. Captain Miller stood at attention. It was subtle, but unmistakable to anyone who had served. He straightened his back. He dipped his head. General Miller said. The word was soft, respectful, but it carried in the silence of the cabin like a gunshot. Julian smiled then. A real smile. Hello, Mike. It's been a while. Captain Miller exhaled. A long breath of relief and disbelief. A while. It's been 10 years, sir. I didn't see your name on the manifest. I was flying incognito, Julian said. I wanted to see how the operation was running. Miller looked around the cabin. He looked at the police officers, who were now looking very confused. He looked at Kevin, who was starting to look sick. He looked at Preston Vance, whose mouth was hanging open. And? Miller asked. How is it running? Julian unbuckled his seatbelt. The click was loud. He stood up. He wasn't just a passenger anymore. He was 6'2", broad-shouldered, and radiating command presence. He adjusted his hoodie, but he might as well have been adjusting a tuxedo. The operation is failing, Mike, Julian said. Julian stepped out into the aisle. He turned to Officer Davis. Officer, you can stand down. There is no threat here. Except perhaps to the career of the man in seat 1B. Officer Davis holstered his thumb. He looked at Captain Miller. Captain, is this man authorized? Captain Miller laughed. It was a dry, incredulous laugh. Authorized? Son, this is Julian Thorne. He bought Meridian Airways last month. He owns the plane. He owns the gate. Hell, he practically owns the fuel in the wings. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum. Preston Vance dropped his phone. It hit the floor with a dull thud. He didn't pick it up. He stared at Julian, his eyes bulging. The blood drained from his face so fast it looked like he might faint. Preston stammered. Julian turned to Preston. He didn't shout. He didn't gloat. He looked at Preston with the clinical detachment of a surgeon looking at a tumor. Mr. Vance, Julian said. You asked me earlier what value I generate. You asked me if I was an inefficiency. Julian reached into his satchel. He pulled out the tablet he had been working on. He tapped the screen and turned it around so Preston could see. It wasn't a game. It wasn't a movie. It was a live organizational chart of the airline, linked to the external audit partners. Vance Consulting, Julian read from the screen. Contracted for efficiency analysis and workforce reduction. Retainer fee, $2 million annually. Julian tapped the screen. A red line appeared through the entry. I am terminating your contract, Mr. Vance. For cause. Preston gasped. You can't do that. I have a binding agreement. Julian stepped closer. Section 4, Paragraph C of your vendor agreement. Julian recited from memory. The conduct clause. Any vendor representing Meridian Airways who engages in behavior that damages the brand or harasses employees is subject to immediate termination. Julian looked at the passengers watching them. You harassed my crew. You attempted to bribe a passenger. You wasted police resources. And you delayed my flight by 45 minutes. Julian looked at his watch. By my calculation, the fuel burn at the gate, the crew overtime, and the missed connection fees for these passengers, you have cost me roughly $18,000 in the last hour. Julian looked back at Preston. That is an inefficiency I cannot tolerate. Preston looked around the room, desperate for an ally. He looked at Kevin. Help me. Tell him. It was a misunderstanding. Kevin, the ground manager, was staring at the floor. He wanted to disappear. He wanted to dissolve into the carpet. Julian turned his gaze to Kevin. Kevin flinched. And you, Julian said. His voice was disappointed. Not angry, which would have been easier to handle. Just disappointed. Kevin, you are the gatekeeper. Your job is to filter the noise so the crew can fly. Today you let the noise in. You let a bully dictate safety protocols. Kevin started, his voice cracking. I thought. He was a Diamond member. You thought money equaled right, Julian finished. You weighed his status against my dignity and you made a calculation. It was the wrong calculation. Julian turned to Captain Miller. Captain, do we have a slot? Miller checked his watch. If we push in 5 minutes, we can make the de-icing pad. But we're heavy. We need to shed weight. Julian nodded. He looked at Preston Vance. Officer Davis, Julian said to the cop. I am now filing a formal complaint. This passenger in 1B has created a hostile work environment and is a liability to the safety of this flight. Under my authority as chairman of the board, and with the concurrence of Captain Miller, I am denying him carriage. Captain Miller nodded. I concur. Get him off my plane. Julian looked at Preston. Mr. Vance, you are deplaning. Now, Preston looked at the officers. They weren't looking at him with sympathy anymore. They were looking at him like a problem they wanted to solve so they could go back to their warm patrol car. Officer Davis stepped forward. He pulled his handcuffs out. Not for Julian. Sir, stand up, Davis said to Preston. Preston scrambled back into his seat, clutching the armrests. No, you can't do this. I'm a platinum partner. I know the CEO. Julian leaned in close. The CEO reports to me, Preston. The fight went out of Preston. He slumped. The reality of the situation crashed down on him. The merger in London. The contract. His reputation. It was all dissolving in the face of the man in the hoodie. Preston stood up. His legs were shaky. He grabbed his briefcase. He grabbed his coat. He looked at Julian one last time. There was no defiance left. Just shock. I didn't know, Preston whispered. That, Julian said, is exactly the problem. You only treat people with respect when you know who they are. Julian stepped aside to let him pass. Get him off the aircraft. And Kevin? Kevin looked up terrified. Yes, Mr. Chairman. Rebook Mr. Vance on a competitor. He is banned from Meridian Airways for life. I don't want his money. It's not worth the paperwork. Officer Davis took Preston by the arm. Let's go, sir. Preston Vance began the walk of shame. It was a long walk. As he moved down the aisle of first class, the passengers didn't look away. They stared. The young tech CEO in 2A gave a little wave. Margaret, the judge in 1F, audibly scoffed as he passed. But the worst part was the silence. Nobody defended him. Nobody said, "That's unfair." The social contract he had relied on, the idea that a suit protects you from consequences, had been shredded. As Preston reached the galley, he stopped. He looked at Elena. She was standing by the door, her arms crossed. She wasn't smiling. She was just watching him. Preston started. Elena pointed to the door. Goodbye, Mr. Vance. Preston stepped onto the jet bridge. The cold air hit him, but it was nothing compared to the chill he felt inside. He heard his phone ping. He looked down. It was an email notification. Subject: Contract termination notice, Meridian Airways. He watched as the police escorted him up the tunnel. He was alone. Back inside the cabin, the tension broke like a fever. A collective exhale swept through the rows. Julian stood in the aisle. He looked at the empty seat in 1B. He picked up the plastic cup of champagne Preston had left on the console. It was warm. He handed it to Elena. Could you dispose of this, please? Julian asked. Elena took the cup. Her hands were steady now. Mr. Thorne. I didn't know. I'm so sorry if I... Julian held up a hand. Elena, you stood your ground. You quoted the regulations. You protected your passenger. You did your job. Elena felt tears prick her eyes. She had expected to be fired. She had expected to be blamed for letting the situation escalate. Thank you, sir, she whispered. Julian turned to Kevin, who was still standing by the door, looking like a man facing a firing squad. Kevin, Julian said. Kevin flinched. I'll pack my desk, sir. Julian shook his head. He sat back down in seat 1A. He buckled his seatbelt. No, you won't, Julian said. Firing you costs me money. Retraining you is an investment. You are going to report to the corporate training center on Monday morning. You are going to retake the bias awareness module, and you are going to spend a week shadowing the complaint resolution team. Julian looked Kevin in the eye. You are going to learn that the cheapest way to run an airline is to treat people fairly. Do you understand? Yes, sir, Kevin breathed, nodding rapidly. Thank you, sir. Now, Julian said, picking up his book. Tell the gate to pull the bridge. We have a schedule to keep. Kevin scrambled out the door. The heavy steel door of the aircraft swung shut. The latch clicked. The world outside, the snow, the police, Preston Vance was locked away. Captain Miller stood in the aisle for a moment longer. He looked at Julian. "Good to have you back," General Miller said. Julian opened his book. "Just Julian, Mike. Let's get to London." Miller grinned and headed back to the cockpit. The cabin lights dimmed. The engines whined to life, a deep, powerful thrum that vibrated through the seats. In seat 1F, Margaret leaned across the aisle. "Excuse me," she said. Julian looked over. "I like the way you handled that," she said. "Very judicial." Julian smiled. "Thank you, Judge." She pointed to his book. "Meditations. Good choice. Stoicism comes in handy." "Does," Julian agreed. "Especially in customer service." Margaret chuckled and went back to her knitting. Julian looked out the window. He saw a figure on the jet bridge stairs, flanked by police officers, walking out into the snow. It was a small figure, insignificant against the backdrop of the massive airport. Julian watched for a moment, then turned away. He opened his spreadsheet again. The fuel hedging numbers hadn't changed, but the atmosphere in the cabin had. The air felt lighter, cleaner. Julian took a sip of water. He adjusted his glasses. He was back to being invisible. He was back to being a passenger. But now, everyone knew exactly who was driving the plane. The first-class cabin settled into a comfortable silence, the kind that only comes when the predator has been removed from the room. The plane pushed back. Julian Thorne went back to work. The cabin of Flight 404 had settled into the rhythmic, muffled hum of cruising altitude. The seatbelt sign was off, the engines were a steady drone, and the scent of warm roasted nuts drifted from the galley. It was the specific tranquility that only exists at 35,000 feet, a detached reality where the problems of the earth below seem abstract and distant. But for the passengers in first class, the reality of what had just happened on the ground was still vibrating in the air. The empty seat in 1B was a ghost. It was a void where a man used to be, a man who had been erased by his own arrogance. Julian Thorne sat in 1A, staring at the clouds illuminated by the moonlight. He had put his tablet away. He wasn't working anymore. He was drinking a glass of sparkling water, his hand resting lightly on the cover of his book. He looked serene, immovable, like a statue carved from obsidian. Elena, the lead flight attendant, moved through the cabin with a level of hyper-awareness she hadn't felt in years. Every motion was precise. She wasn't terrified anymore. She was awestruck. She approached row 1 with the dinner menu, her hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice dropping to a respectful whisper. "Would you care to see the menu for this evening? Or perhaps something from the reserve list?" Julian turned from the window. He took off his reading glasses. He looked at her, really looked at her, noticing the fatigue lines around her eyes and the way her posture had stiffened. "Elena," he said gently, "you don't need to do that." "Do what, sir?" "You don't need to walk on eggshells. I am not a deity. I am a passenger who happens to sign the checks. If the chicken is dry, I'm not going to fire the chef." Elena let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding since Chicago. A small, genuine smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "The chicken is actually pretty good tonight, sir. But stay away from the pasta." Julian chuckled. A rich, warm sound. "Duly noted. I'll take the chicken." "And Elena?" "Yes, sir. When we land in Heathrow, I'm going to need the incident report log. I want to make sure your statement is the primary record. I don't want the ground team spinning this to cover their tracks." "I've already drafted it in my head, sir," Elena said, straightening her shoulders. "I'm putting everything in." "Good. Accuracy is the best defense." As Elena walked away, the young man in seat 2A, the tech CEO with the Patagonia vest, leaned forward. He had been bursting to speak for the last hour. He held his phone like it was a holy relic. "Excuse me, sir?" the young man whispered. Julian turned. He saw the hunger in the kid's eyes. It was the hunger for content. "Yes. My name is Mark. I run a fintech startup in Austin. Look, I don't want to disturb you, but I got it all." Julian raised an eyebrow. "Got what?" "The video," Mark whispered, tapping his screen. "From the moment he spilled the water to the moment the captain saluted you. It's cinema, man. The way you handled him. The cheapest way to run an airline is to treat people fairly. That line is going to break the internet." Julian's face remained impassive. He looked at the phone in Mark's hand. He knew the power of that device. It could build a brand or destroy a life in 6 hours. You recorded it? Julian asked. Every second. Mark grinned. I haven't posted it yet. I wanted to ask, do I have your permission? This guy, Vance? He deserves to be exposed. People need to see this. Julian extended his hand. May I? Mark handed the phone over, eager for validation. Julian watched the video. The shaky camera work, the audio capturing Preston's screeching demands, and then his own calm, deep voice dismantling the consultant's ego. It was indeed a powerful piece of media. It was justice packaged for consumption. Julian watched until the end, where Preston was led away. He handed the phone back. Mark, Julian said. You are a CEO, correct? Mark nodded. Yeah. Then you understand leverage, Julian said. Right now, Mr. Vance is currently in a taxi or a hotel room, trying to construct a narrative where he is the victim. He is calling his lawyers. He is calling his partners. He is trying to get ahead of the story. Julian paused, taking a sip of water. If you post that video now, it becomes a viral sensation. It becomes entertainment. People will mock him, make memes, and forget him in 24 hours. Mark frowned. So, you don't want me to post it? I didn't say that, Julian said, a glint of steel returning to his eyes. I am saying timing is everything. Wait until tomorrow morning. Let him think he has contained it. Let him lie to his board. Let him issue a statement denying the events. Julian leaned closer to the gap between the seats. And then, once he has committed to his lie, then you release the video. That is not just embarrassment, Mark. That is impeachment. Mark stared at Julian. His mouth opened slightly. That is diabolical. That is strategy, Julian corrected. And Mark? Yeah. Blur the faces of the police officers and the crew. They were just doing their jobs. Focus the lens on the behavior. Mark nodded slowly, looking at Julian with a newfound fear and respect. You got it, sir. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Julian turned back to the window. He closed his eyes. He wasn't vindictive. He just believed in efficiency. And allowing Preston Vance to survive this with his reputation intact would be highly inefficient for the industry. 4,000 miles away, in the harsh fluorescent light of the O'Hare Arrivals Hall, Preston Vance was screaming into his phone. He was sitting on his expensive suitcase, his tie undone, his coat wet with melted snow. He looked like a shipwreck survivor who had washed up on a tile floor. People walked past him, giving him a wide berth. He was radioactive with rage. I don't care what the police report says, Bob, Preston yelled, ignoring the stares of passersby. The man was a plant. It was a setup. He baited me. On the other end of the line, Bob Reynolds, the managing partner of Vance Consulting, was sitting in his home office in Connecticut. He rubbed his temples. Preston, listen to me. You were removed from a flight by the chairman of the client we are auditing. Do you understand the gravity of that? We have a $20 million retainer with Meridian. He's crazy, Bob. Preston insisted, his voice cracking. He was wearing a hoodie. He looked like a nobody. How was I supposed to know? That is the problem, Preston. Bob snapped. You didn't know. You made an assumption based on optics, and you bet the firm's reputation on it. I just got an email from their legal counsel. They are invoking the conduct clause. They are terminating the contract effective immediately. Fix it. Preston pleaded. Call the board. Tell them I was stressed. Tell them I'm seeking therapy. Just don't let them cancel the contract. It's too late, Bob said, his voice cold. And Preston? What? Don't come into the office on Monday. We need to distance ourselves. Take a leave of absence. Indefinite. The line went dead. Preston stared at the phone. The end call screen faded to black. He looked up. He saw his reflection in the glass doors of the terminal. He looked small. He looked tired. He looked exactly like the kind of person he despised. Someone with no power, no leverage, and nowhere to go. He opened his email. He saw the notification from Meridian Airways. Subject: lifetime ban notification. He went to reply to type out a furious, litigious response. But his thumb hovered over the screen. A wave of exhaustion hit him. He realized for the first time in his career that he couldn't talk his way out of this. He couldn't buy his way out. He put the phone in his pocket. He dragged his suitcase toward the taxi stand, his Louis Vuitton bag scraping against the dirty floor, sounding like a dying animal. London Heathrow, 7 a.m. The flight landed smoothly, the wheels kissing the tarmac with a gentle thud that signaled the end of the journey. As the plane taxied to the gate, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to London. On behalf of the entire crew, and especially our special guest in seat 1A, we thank you for flying Meridian. We apologize for the delay in Chicago, but we hope the smooth ride made up for it." The passengers in first class looked at Julian. He didn't wave. He simply packed his book into his bag, put on his glasses and waited for the light to turn off. When the door opened, the station manager for Heathrow was waiting at the end of the jet bridge. He was flanked by 2 ground staff members. They looked nervous. Julian walked off the plane. He nodded to Elena. "Get some rest, Elena. I'll see you on the return leg next week." "Thank you, Mr. Thorne." Julian stepped onto the bridge. The station manager rushed forward. "Mr. Thorne, welcome to London. Let me take your bag, sir. We have a car waiting on the tarmac. We can bypass immigration processing." Julian held up a hand. He tightened his grip on the handle of his battered leather satchel. "I can carry my own bag, thank you. And I will go through immigration like everyone else. I want to see how long the lines are at Terminal 3. The station manager blinked. "Of course, sir. But the car? I'll take the Heathrow Express," Julian said. "It's faster during rush hour." He walked past the stunned staff, merging into the stream of tired travelers. He didn't want the bubble. The bubble made you soft. The bubble made you Preston Vance. Understand. 2 days later, the boardroom of Meridian Airways, London headquarters. The room was glass and steel, overlooking the grey Thames. 12 people sat around a mahogany table that cost more than most houses. These were the power brokers, the CFO, the COO, the VP of legal, and the external auditors from a rival firm. Julian sat at the head of the table. He wasn't wearing a hoodie today. He was wearing a bespoke Savile Row suit, navy blue, impeccable. But his demeanor hadn't changed. He was still the stillness in the center of the storm. On the screen at the far end of the room, a video was playing. It was Mark's video. It had been uploaded 24 hours ago. It currently had 12 million views. The title was blunt. CEO of Meridian Airways teaches racist bully a lesson in class. Julian pressed pause on the remote just as the video showed Preston Vance's face crumbling in realization. He looked around the table. The executives were silent. Some looked uncomfortable. Some looked proud. "We have received 3,000 emails in the last 12 hours, the VP of PR said nervously. 99% are positive. The stock price is up 4% since the market opened. People are calling it the Thorne effect." Julian didn't smile. He placed the remote on the table. "This is not a marketing campaign," Julian said quietly. "This is a diagnostic test. And we almost failed." He stood up and walked to the window. Mr. Vance was not an anomaly. He was a symptom. He felt comfortable behaving that way because our culture, the culture of diamond status and high-value assets, told him he was untouchable. We sold him the idea that money buys permission to abuse. Julian turned back to the room. "I am introducing a new clause to our conditions of carriage today. The legal team has the draft. We are calling it the dignity standard." He gestured to the CFO. "From now on, any passenger, regardless of status, who verbally abuses crew or fellow passengers will not just be removed. They will be banned. And any employee who intervenes to protect the dignity of the cabin will be indemnified and rewarded, regardless of the value of the customer they offend." The CFO cleared his throat. "Sir, that sounds noble. But the high net worth segment, if they feel we are policing their behavior, we might lose contracts." Julian looked at the CFO. The same look he had given Preston Vance. "We just fired a consulting firm that paid us $2 million a year," Julian said. "And in return we gained $12 million in free brand advertising and the loyalty of our entire workforce." Julian leaned his hands on the table. "Competence is the currency, John. not arrogance. If a customer cannot handle the basic requirement of human decency, they are too expensive for us to carry. Do I make myself clear? Crystal clear, Mr. Thorne. Good. Now let's discuss the fuel hedging report.
Understand
Epilogue. 6 months later. The training center for Meridian Airways in Dallas was a bustling campus of mock fuselages and classrooms. In room 304, a group of new hires was sitting in a circle, debriefing a role-play scenario. Sitting in the back of the room was Kevin, the former ground manager from Chicago. He looked different. He had lost weight. He wasn't wearing a high-vis vest anymore. He was wearing a trainer's polo shirt. He looked less frantic, more grounded. He was listening to a young trainee explain how she would handle a difficult VIP passenger. I would just give him what he wants so the flight isn't delayed, the trainee said. Kevin stood up. He walked to the center of the circle. He didn't bark. He didn't check his watch. Let's pause there, Kevin said softly. He picked up a marker and wrote a number on the whiteboard. 18,000. Does anyone know what this number is? Kevin asked. Silence. This is the dollar amount I cost the company in 45 minutes because I was afraid to say no to a suit, Kevin said. He turned to the class. I used to think my job was to move metal. I thought if the plane left on time I won. But I was wrong. My job, your job, is to protect the environment inside the tube. Because if the people inside don't feel safe, the plane doesn't matter. He looked at the trainees. Never trade your authority for someone else's comfort. If you are right, stand your ground. The chairman has your back. I learned that the hard way. The door to the classroom opened. Elena walked in. She was wearing a new uniform, the stripes on her sleeve indicating she was now a Czech airman, responsible for training standards across the fleet. She smiled at Kevin. Ready for the final simulation, Kevin? She asked. Kevin smiled back. A real smile born of a second chance that he knew he had earned. Ready when you are, Elena.
Understand
High above the Atlantic on Flight 902 to Tokyo, a man sat in seat 34K, deep in the economy cabin. He was wearing a gray hoodie and reading glasses. He was eating the standard pasta meal from a foil tray. Next to him, a teenager was playing a video game, oblivious to his neighbor. The teenager nudged the man. Hey, can you pass me the salt? The man nodded, picked up the packet and handed it over. Here you go. Thanks, the kid said. Then he paused. He looked at the man. He looked at the gray hoodie. He looked at the book on the tray table, Meditations. Wait. The kid whispered. You look just like that guy. You know? The CEO? The one from the video? The man smiled. He adjusted his glasses. I get that a lot, Julian Thorne said. He turned back to his window, watching the curvature of the earth. He wasn't the chairman right now. He wasn't a hero. He was just a passenger, sitting in a seat he had paid for, surrounded by people he respected enough to serve. And for Julian, that was the only status that mattered.